All right, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Grab a drink, grab some food real quick.
Do you want to use this just to make sure?
Okay. So I have notes here, what I'm supposed to say, but I've been busy all day, and I haven't had a chance to read them, so I apologize. But we have Brad waiting. Thank you, Brad, waiting. So I just told him I'm a huge groupie. In my house, I have the Kindle version and the physical version, and it's all worked up with highlighter notes. So we're going to talk about starting an entrepreneurial ecosystem in the Tampa Bay region here today. So thank you all so much for being here. I want to thank Valpak, certainly. Thank you so much, Valpak, for sponsoring us here tonight, and also to Florida Blue for paying for the food and beverages. Yay! Yay! I know we're looking forward to hearing from Brad, and Brad will be taking questions at the end of his presentation. If you have a question, please come up to the podium and speak to the laptop so Brad can hear you. Be nice, they'll be here. You know who you are. We hope everyone will stay to participate in the interactive ideation session after Brad's presentation. We have all these little bags on the tables, and we're very excited about it. I think you guys will really enjoy the ideation session afterwards. So again, I want to thank Florida Blue and also Valpak. And let's see, is there a Florida Blue representative here to? No. Okay. So, okay. So now I'm going to introduce John Morrow. John Morrow is known to many of you. He's an amazing supporter, mentor, just all-around good guy. Oh, look at that! Yay! You got more applause than Florida Blue for getting us the booth. What's that all about? You paid them? That's awesome. So I'm going to pass it off to John, and he's going to introduce them.
Thanks.
Oh, he's right there. You're going to have to bend down.
Hi, Brad. Brad Feld has been an early-stage investor and entrepreneur since 1987. He's currently a managing director at Foundry Group, a venture capital group that's focused on early-stage information technology companies. Prior to Foundry Group, he co-founded Bias Venture Capital and Intensity Ventures. Brad's also the co-founder of Techstars, which is the #1 startup accelerator in the world. Currently serves as the board of director on 15 technology companies, and he's invested in or sat on the boards of over a dozen other companies. Brad holds a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science degrees in Management Science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he's also authored a number of books, including Startup Communities, Building an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in Your City. And his latest book is Startup Life, Surviving and Thriving in a Relationship with an Entrepreneur, which he co-authored with his wife, Amy Bachelor.
John, you can write a book.
I think so. He's done a better job of it than I have. So without any further delay, I will give you Brad.
Thanks. So I just want to make sure everybody can hear me okay. Raise your hands if you can hear me. Awesome. All right, so if for some reason the audio or the video goes out, I'm delegating to the person right in the middle that's the tall guy with a greenish shirt on, you, the one that's squirming. Your job if the audio or video goes out is to go like this. Of course, if the video goes out, I can't see that, but you get it. So I'll talk for 15 or 20 minutes, and then do some Q&A and go wherever y'all want to go with the conversation. You heard my background. I've been an investor for a long time. In 2010, I started to think about what had happened that had resulted in Boulder becoming an internationally recognized startup community. I moved to Boulder in 1995. I lived in Boston from 83 to 95. I went to school there and started my first company in Boston. It was acquired by a public company in 1993. And my wife was from Alaska, so Boston wasn't home for us. I grew up in Dallas, Texas. And when I sold my first company, I told Amy that by the time I was 30, we'd be out of Boston. And 2 months before I turned 30, she told me that she was moving to Boulder and I was welcome to come with her. So we were married at the time, so it was more like a polite suggestion. We knew one person in Boulder, and he moved away a couple of months later. So we moved to Boulder to live, not to work. And by 1995, when we moved to Boulder, I was already investing as an angel investor with my own money in Boston, where we were living, New York, where I had a network, Bay Area, LA, and Seattle, all places where I had done business and had friends and, had developed relationships. And so I figured worst case, Boulder would be right in the middle of the country, and I had no expectation of any sort of startup community or startup community activity. And by 2010, so 15 years later, I realized I'd been part of something that was very powerful that existed well before I got to Boulder in 1995. So I can only really speak from my experience from 1995 onward, but there was certainly a startup community in Boulder prior to 1995, and lots of the seeds of what got developed over that period of time. When I started thinking about it, I started talking to a bunch of people in Boulder, and I talked to a bunch of people in lots of other places, and you don't have to go back that far. In 2010, the notion of entrepreneurship and startup community was just starting to be emergent again. Right, in 2010, we were still on the tail end of the global economic crisis, or still in the Great Recession, or whatever people want to call it. And the entrepreneurial activity, which is in full bloom today in 2013, 2007, 2008, 2009 was kind of when some of the things that have really borne fruit today were getting developed. So for Boulder to be in this place where it was this internationally viewed startup community was quite interesting. So I came up with a thesis, which I call the Boulder thesis, which has 4 principles that I believe if you apply to any city in the world, you can create a vibrant, long-term entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I've actually come to the conclusion that not only can every city that's over a certain size, and Boulder's only 100,000 people, so 50,000, 75,000 people. I have a house in Homer, Alaska, which is only 5,000 people. That's too small. But when you get enough people, 7,500,000 people, the idea that you can create a startup community that's vibrant and sustainable is possible. And in fact, I believe that it's necessary for every city to have a vibrant startup community as part of it, because that vibrant startup community is part of the thing that keeps the city fresh and young and new and moving forward and constantly innovating. And all you really need to do is look at cities like Detroit to understand what can happen when a city that at one point was an incredible startup community in the 1930s and 1940s and even the 1950s, reaches some place where it doesn't continue to refresh and innovate and move forward. And ironically, today Detroit is quite an interesting startup community, as a city that has infrastructure for about 2.5 million people, has 750,000 people in it, and a bunch of entrepreneurs who are saying, let's try to figure out how to turn this into something great again. Which, for any of you who have been involved in companies, success and failure is part of the entrepreneurial cycle. So you get used to this notion of things being created and torn down and recreated along the curve. So I came up with these 4 principles. I started talking about them pretty broadly. I wrote some blog posts about it and eventually turned into the book Startup Communities, which came out in September. And I've probably given some version of this talk now 100 or 150 times. And what I'm finding is that virtually everywhere I go, there are groups of people who really are passionate about creating a startup community where they live. And it's fascinating to see how powerful and how much progress a lot of people are making in very short periods of time. So let me walk through the 4 principles, and I'll go into some depth with you on them, and then we'll do Q&A and go wherever y'all want to go for the remaining time. So the first principle is that the startup community has to be led by entrepreneurs. I separate the universe of people that participate in a startup community into 2 categories. I call them leaders and feeders. And I could call them, pens that are green and mice. Doesn't matter. They're just words. But they are really separate functional contributors. the leaders have to be entrepreneurs. Everyone else is a feeder. Government's a feeder. University is a feeder. Big companies are feeders. Investors like venture capitalists are feeders. I'm a feeder. Service providers, the lawyers, and accountants are feeders. Now, individual members of organizations that are feeders can play a leadership role. So, you know, a professor at the university can play a leadership role. Someone in economic development in the city can play a leadership role. But the institution itself can't. And this is a really important construct. All of the organizations that I'm talking about are hierarchies. And as hierarchies, they have a boss. People have a boss, and there's a boss's boss, and there's a boss's boss's boss. There's measurement, there's allocation of resources, there's if I do something, what kind of a return do I get on the investment? There's different incentives. A startup community is a network. And it's a network in a lot of ways that startups are networks. And we're used to this notion of networks in our society today, partly because of the social networking phenomena and the way we communicate using computers. But this idea that the way that you create power and influence on the network is not through where you are relative to someone else in the hierarchy, but through what you're actually doing in terms of contributing to the system. And most entrepreneurs and most entrepreneurial companies are networks. And sure, they have some hierarchy in them at some point. But anybody who's been an entrepreneur, when you collide with a hierarchical organization, whether it's a big company or whether it's government or university, you understand that friction point, the struggle that happens when those two things intersect. Hierarchies tend to want to control things. Networks tend to spread and evolve very rapidly. So the essence of this is that you have to have this very organic leadership dynamic, and the leaders have to be entrepreneurial in nature, and importantly, they have to be the entrepreneurs, and you'll see how that links through the rest of the thesis. In addition, it's not that every entrepreneur in the community has to be a leader. You just need a critical mass. And a critical mass is not a big number. It might be a half a dozen. So in Boulder, when I look back to 1995, there were probably a dozen or so entrepreneurs in Boulder in 1995 that played leadership roles that today are still active as leaders in the Boulder startup community. There's probably 100 entrepreneurs today that are playing leadership roles. And there's probably 1,000 entrepreneurs in the Boulder startup community, maybe more. So it's not that everyone has to do it. It's not that everyone that is a leader has to do everything. But it's that you have to have this critical mass. The second principle is that you have to take a very long-term view. I like to talk about it being at least a generational view, at least 20 years. The reason for this is that it takes a long time to create stuff. For those of you in the room that are entrepreneurs or have been involved in startup companies, startups don't get created in a year or two. Every now and then, you know, somebody gets bought for $1 billion after 2 or 3 years. But that's an edge case. That's the extreme exception, not the norm. Normally, it takes 5, 10, 15, 20 years to build a company. And a startup community is the same way. It takes a long time to build a really robust and sustainable startup community. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of the feeder organizations can't be the leader. This is why government can't be the leader of the startup community. Government runs on a 2 to 4 year cycle. And in fact, with elections, government's actually only really effective 1 to 3 years. And government really cares about measuring the return over that period of time. It's very hard for government to take a 20-year view. University takes an annual view, has an annual rhythm. Ironically, an annual rhythm that starts in the middle of the year. And if you've ever been involved in university or anybody here is a professor, you know that you care about these 1-year cycles that are broken up into smaller cycles unless you're trying to get tenure, in which case you only care about a 7-year cycle, and there's only one thing that's important to you during that period of time, which is getting tenure. So these other organizations, you know, big businesses run on quarterly rhythms and annual rhythms. They don't have a 20-year view. The startup community and the leaders of the startup community have to take a 20-year view. Now, it gets a little more complicated in that it's not a 20-year view that ends after 20 years. So I've been in Boulder 17 years, and I'm not 17 years into my 20-year journey. I'm 17 years into a 37-year journey. And 5 years from now, I'll be 22 years into a 42-year journey. And I accept my mortality and my journey will end at some point. Or I'll get tired of being involved in the Boulder startup community and I'll disengage, or I won't play the same kind of leadership role that I played. That's all fine. You have to have this long-term view from today. The third principle is that you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community at any level. Leader, feeder, first-time entrepreneur, aspiring entrepreneur, student, somebody that just moved to Tampa, somebody that moved away from Tampa but wants to stay connected. Doesn't matter what your experience base is, doesn't matter what your background is. The startup community has to be inclusive. There is no president of the Boulder startup community. And there's no vice president of membership, and there's no vice president of education, and there's no vice president of financing or finance. It's just this messy network. And what you want is to make it easy as a startup community for anyone who wants to engage in your network in any way. And sure, there are occasionally some bad actors, and there's some people that don't really get it, or there are people who do different things, and I talk about a lot of fundamental problems in the book, like the patriarch problem, which are the handful of people, that are the fathers of the city who try to control everything. And I offer some suggestions in the book for how to address things like the patriarch problem. If you're really building a startup community, you'll be inclusive of anyone, and you'll let the system work itself out in terms of those people. And they'll either change their behavior or they'll go find something else to do because they won't be able to participate in the spirit of inclusivity of what's going on. The fourth principle is that you have to have activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack on a continual basis. And these are things like accelerators like Techstars, things like Startup Weekend, which for those of you that haven't done a Startup Weekend is a 54-hour simulation of entrepreneurship where companies get created over a weekend. And Startup Weekend is not just to teach people entrepreneurship, nor is it about just creating companies, but it's about working side by side with other people who are interested in entrepreneurship in a very low-risk way. After 54 hours, the weekend's over and you go home. So you get this experience and this muscle building both with other people in your startup community, people who potentially could be co-founders, people who might be employees of a company that you start, people whose company you might join if you're an aspiring entrepreneur but you don't have a company idea yet. If you take those kinds of activities and events and have them going on continually, it's very powerful. And I'm not talking about cocktail parties. I'm not talking about networking events at rich people's houses. Those things are nice. Entrepreneur of the Year events. They're not sufficient. You need things that actually get people working on entrepreneurship together to learn, practice, engage with each other. And it's not the case that you end up with a problem of having too many things going on. In Boulder, in a typical month, there might be 100 to 200 events, activities and events in 1 month in a 100,000 person town. I can't possibly go to all of them, nor do I want to. That's the point. The point is that you want to have so much stuff going on that you can't avoid it. And anytime somebody comes to town, there's things to do. And anytime somebody wants to do something, there's things to do. And remember, there's no vice president of education. So anybody in the room that wants to start something can do it. If you're looking for PHP developers or Ruby developers and you're having trouble recruiting and hiring people, the best way to do it is to start a Ruby meetup. And all of a sudden have the event where all the Ruby developers come to that you're hosting. And you don't have to ask anybody permission. It costs you $10 a month to set up a meetup group on meetup.com. Off you go. So it's this kind of dynamic of things that are always happening. And if you sort of play back through these four pieces, it's activities and events that supersaturate the startup community. This notion of inclusiveness of anyone who wants to engage at any level. This idea that you're playing a very long-term game and that you're looking out far into the future and you're investing energy in something that has a long-term outcome. And that you have a critical mass of entrepreneurs who are playing leadership roles. Again, linked to this notion of inclusiveness, so anybody who wants to participate can. So the last comment I'll give you before we shift to Q&A is there's a philosophy that underlies all this, which I talk about some in startup communities, which is give before you get. And there's a great article in this weekend's New York Times Magazine, I think everybody can get it online. I don't think it's behind the New York Times paywall, about a professor who's been studying this notion of people who give before they get is kind of the way I'd articulate it. He's just written a book called Give and Take that's supposed to be out, within weeks. And it's a very powerful construct, this notion of give before you get. And I want to differentiate it from another phrase you hear a lot, which is pay it forward. So especially around mentorship, you hear the justification for mentorship is pay it forward. Somebody helped me, therefore I want to help somebody else, in the generational phenomena of them growing and developing. That's powerful and important. Give before you get is fundamentally different. Give before you get is that I'm willing to put energy into something without any expectation of what's going to come back. It's not altruistic. I expect to get something back from the energy I put into the system. I just don't know what it's going to be. So I'm not defining a transactional relationship up front. A good way to explain how this works is the difference between an advisor and a mentor. And everybody now calls himself mentor because mentor is a powerful and a trendy word. But many people who call themselves mentors are actually advisors. Here's the difference. An advisor says, I'll help you with your company for $1,000 a month retainer. Or I'll help you with your company if you give me 1% of the equity. A mentor says, how can I help? There's plenty of room in the world for advisors, but the world needs a lot more mentors. And if you want to build a really powerful, engaged startup community, you'll adopt a give before you get attitude towards your startup community. You'll put energy into it without knowing what's going to come out of it transactionally. And this is especially powerful when you take a long-term point of view. So let me stop there in terms of the talk. It's about 20-25 minutes. Let's do Q&A. Happy to go wherever y'all want on startup communities or any of the things that are relevant to you sort of in this group.
So whoever has a question, just come on up. Come on. We got Brad here. No questions? Come on. Come on.
If you have no questions, I just go back to answering emails. So
if you'll talk in first, they can hear you, and then...
Hey, Brad. Can you maybe talk about some misconceptions around what people think might be good ideas for startup communities that you've seen fail and that we should possibly avoid?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of examples of misconceptions. Here are a couple of quick hits. Number one, that throwing more money at the problem solves things. So one of the things that I talk about in the book that I hear everywhere is there's not enough capital. And that's true. It's a true statement. There's never enough capital. There will never be enough capital. You can always consume more capital. A lot of times people think the solution to getting capital in their startup community is to do things that are unnatural. The government all of a sudden tosses a bunch of money at something, which is really just reallocating tax dollars to startups, which most entrepreneurs actually wouldn't be that comfortable with if they actually thought it through that way, because that's not the essence of how a lot of entrepreneurs think. They don't actually want everybody else's tax dollars to be funding their startup. Or another example might be that you believe that you have to have a university, a research university at the core. A research university is quite helpful, but it's not the core of the startup community. And in fact, the most valuable thing a university provides for a startup community is young people. Every year, new people come to the university, and every year, young people graduate from the university. And if you can figure out how to wire up your startup community to those new, young, well-educated people, you have a chance to get them to flow from the university into the startup community. That's very powerful. That's actually much more powerful than a research lab that's DoD funded that has a professor toiling away somewhere. Now, that professor toiling away somewhere who might be able to create a company, potentially a good thing, but it gets overvalued, right? The pitfall is that becomes the thing that everybody focuses on. Another example is this idea that you have to ask permission in the startup community. And this comes in a lot of places. I ran into this in a couple of different cities recently where people are like, yeah, we really want to do this, but Joe, successful entrepreneur in town, Joe, we're not sure if Joe likes that. The hell with Joe. Just do it. And Joe, if Joe's a good guy, Joe will probably like it. And if Joe's a jerk, doesn't matter, right? So this notion of just doing versus having to ask for permission is super important. The last one I'd give you is this idea that you have to have these super visible things that everybody points at. Big company like Google in town, or super successful startup in town, or whatever. And what I found, if you take a 20-year view, stuff like that emerges based on the natural resources of whatever you have. If you try to artificially configure it on the front end, the amount of effort that you put into the payoff is very low. Occasionally it has impact, but most of the time it has an impact that looks like this. As a short-term impact, lots of people get excited about it, lots of talking about it, but then it's not really that good, and then it starts to suck, and then people lose interest in it, and then it goes away. And you see that over and over again when things are forced rather than organic. And so if you're taking this very long-term view, you have a much better chance of it being organic. There's a few that are classic mistakes.
Okay, who else has a question?
Hey, Brad, I love the book.
So now that you've told us why all the excuses everybody has said that we aren't going to succeed are garbage, what are the #1 things that you and Amy learned as a couple that you think we should take away so we can go on with this long-term view?
Well, if you come back to the origin story of us moving to Boulder, we moved to Boulder because we were looking for a place we wanted to live the rest of our life. So we chose the place to live based on where we wanted to live, not based on attributes like a job, a career, where we thought we should be. You know, based on what I was doing in Boston, a logical place for me to go would be the Bay Area. I went to MIT. A bunch of MIT people end up in the Bay Area. I had good network in the Bay Area. I had a bunch of investments in the Bay Area. I just had no interest in living in the Bay Area. It wasn't where I wanted to be. And so as a couple, defining where we wanted to live and then focusing our energy, not all of it, but our energy on living in that place and being part of that place we were living was very powerful to us as an entrepreneurial couple, and was very grounding for me in all of the challenges and ups and downs that, you know, entrepreneurship brings, which is a ton of stuff that works and a ton of stuff that doesn't work, and constant pressure and disappointment and confusion, and sometimes it's macro that's causing you stress, and sometimes it's self-inflicted, and sometimes it's utterly random. Independent, though, by the way, of all the stresses of life. I mean, being in a relationship just by itself is hard. I mean, humans are messy, sloppy, complicated things. And I think knowing that we were committed to being in a place for a long period of time helped with a whole bunch of those things. And also caused both of us, when we were feeling worn out for one reason or another, gave us a place to retreat to. So, you know, I'm involved in lots of stuff all over the country. I travel a lot. I'm personally completely exhausted. I've been blogging some. I've been struggling some with depressive episode for the last 5 or 6 months. I had a tough end of year physically. I had a kidney surgery, and I had a bike accident where I got beat up pretty bad. And, you know, I just decided at some point to cancel all my travel for 2013 because I have a place that's grounded. And, you know, I can continue to be very engaged everywhere as an entrepreneur using the technology today, but still be part of something that I feel really strongly about. So I encourage people to try to find the place they want to live. So when you have the requisite down part of the cycle, which you will, whether it's a business down cycle, an intellectual down cycle, creative, emotional, I don't care, you have real grounding with the place. And it's one of the powerful things about a startup community that develops and becomes very healthy. I'm in my office in downtown Boulder. I go out and wander around downtown Boulder, and I see friends because the entrepreneurs are here in downtown Boulder. And so I don't have to spend time with them if I don't feel like it, but if I want to see them, I'm with them. It's a very powerful construct to be part of that notion of community in both a business and a cultural sense. So those would be some of the things. The last, for those of you that haven't read Startup Life, hopefully some of you will. I encourage it. I would be a bad book salesman if I didn't promote it. Amy and I worked hard on writing a book that's not our autobiography or not our biography. It's got a lot of storytelling about us, and we've got about 20 other entrepreneurs who have contributed to it. But we try to talk about what over our 22-year relationship, including about a dozen years ago, we almost split up, what we've done and how we've learned how to be effective in this chaotic up and down entrepreneurial cycle. And a big part of it comes back to a very simple construct of communication. Just learning how to communicate. It's so basic. And that's true in the context of startup community. You're playing a game that's not a zero-sum game. You're not playing winners versus losers. Everyone in the room, the cliche of everybody, both teams on the soccer field of kids are winners, and it's like, yeah, BS, that's not really true. Like, there is a winner and a loser. In the context of the startup community, everybody can actually be a winner because you're building something in the context of a much larger city. And so you're not playing a zero-sum game where each person in this room is trying to take market share from each other. You're doing something that represents a relatively small part of Tampa. You're trying to grow the overall ecosystem. So that's very powerful, and that's powerful in the context of community as well as relationship, because then you have this notion of inclusiveness, notion of give before you get, this idea that, if you're frustrated with something, talk about it. And as one of my partners likes to say, don't just bitch. Like, bitching is fine, but let's a couple of suggestions for what we can do to solve the problem. Unless you just want to bitch and then just say, I just want some empathy, right? I don't actually want you to solve my problem. I just want to complain a little. That's okay too. So those are some of the things I think that you can link those two together.
Hi, Brad. We're very happy to have you here via Google, by the way. So glad that you're healthy and staying back in Boulder. I hear you speak about the entrepreneurial community, and I haven't really heard you address the angel community and perhaps even the venture capital community, and how vibrant does that need to be locally in order to help sustain the entrepreneurial community?
Yep. So the angel and the venture capital communities play different roles that have a lot of overlap. I would actually suggest that the angel community is much, much more important than the venture community in the development of a startup community. And when I say that, I don't mean an organized angel group. What I mean is individual angel investors who are actively writing checks and participating in the startup community. And they can be part of an angel group if they want, but the powerful thing is that there be angels who are writing checks, and the checks don't have to be big. They can be $25,000 or $50,000 checks. The idea is that the easiest capital base to develop in a startup community like yours is that early stage, the first $1 million into a company, the first $500,000 or $1 million into the company. That's the easiest capital phase to develop. Question number one, are there any wealthy people in your town? Every town has wealthy people. Are there any successful business people or people who have created their own companies, whether they're tech entrepreneurs or not? Yes. Right? So there's always plenty of money around in the potential pockets that are angel investors. There's often just not a culture of angel investors investing in the next wave of startups. So figuring out how to cultivate and nurture those angel investors, whether it be individually or through organized groups, that's the most important thing. I've written a bunch of posts about this. In Startup Life, I have a whole section about how to be an effective angel investor. And one of the things for those of you in the room that are angel investors, or if you're an entrepreneur who has a relationship with angel investors, the most important thing for angel investors are to be promiscuous. Angel investors should write a lot of small checks, not a few big checks. Number one, it's a much better financing strategy as an angel investor. You're going to end up with a much higher chance that you're going to hit that 1 out of 100 that returns 100x, or that one company that returns 100 times your money. And if you get that, you can have 99 things that return none of your money, and you're still break even. If you only make a few investments and you're putting all your eggs in a small number of companies, that's not good. Second, it's better for the startup community because you're helping enable more companies get money raised. And angel investors tend to pile on each other. So somebody finds something they're interested in, their friends invest with them. And then another one finds something they're interested in, their friends invest with them. So even if you're writing $25,000 checks, you might represent $500,000 as an angel investor because of other people who like to invest in you. When I lived in Boston between 1994 and 96, I made 40 angel investments. Every one was either $25,000 or $50,000. I always wrote the same size check. But most of the investments that I invested in, if I was the lead, which happened about a third of the time, $500,000 would come behind my $25,000 overnight. And I wouldn't do anything. I wouldn't take any fees or anything from that. I was just helping the entrepreneur get a bigger financing done. So that's the level that I would focus on. What happens is really interesting. The next level, the next couple of $1 million, $2 to $5 million, it's really hard to raise no matter what. Even if you have a successful venture capital or a significant venture capital community, it's still hard to raise. If you get through that phase, and you're a growing company, the next chunk of capital is easy to raise. So if you can get an angel community that's vibrant and going and planting lots of seeds, knowing that lots of things will fail, but you're investing small amounts of money, so when something fails and the entrepreneur cleans up and gets back ready to go again, you're there for the second investment in that same entrepreneur because that entrepreneur learned a bunch of stuff from that first thing that didn't work. Eventually, a couple of, again, 20-year view, a couple of companies will break through that middle barrier. They'll find some investment. You'll have a local venture firm. You'll have a venture firm from Miami. You'll have a venture firm from Atlanta. You'll have a venture firm from Boulder who finds something. You'll have enough of those that get to the next level, and all of a sudden the later stage capital will start to show up. And that later stage capital always shows up when there's successful companies. So in terms of developing capital, that earliest stage is the most powerful.
There's my comment over here. Hey.
Hey.
My name's Jacob Redding. I'm one of these people that just moved to a place where he sort of wants to live, not from a place where he's been living. So I recently just moved to Tampa, and I was curious on your take on when building a startup community, when do you focus on a niche and when do you let chaos reign? So for example, I lived in New York City for a number of years. In New York City's the tech community is very focused on internet and web applications and mobile applications. Then I was in Oregon, moved a company over there. It's very focused on biotech, Department of Defense. San Francisco has its own focus, DC, very NGO focus. What's your take on niches, like finding your niche as a community or just letting everything happen?
So I think that it's a really powerful concept, and I describe it differently than finding a niche. Instead, I'd encourage you to focus on what your natural resources are. So if you think of every city in the world, every city exists in some place because some person or set of people decided to start a city there. And they started a city there because it had a river, or it had good land, or the wagon broke down, or who knows? There was oil in the ground. Think of that natural resource, and now turn that natural resource into the equivalent of what natural resources are in 2013, which sometimes is physical, but a lot of times is an intellectual natural resource. It's a university. It's a particular type of domain. It's a type of business. It's the fact that you're a port and there's a certain type of activity. Whatever, doesn't matter. Focus on those natural resources, but don't limit yourself to them. So there's a lot of value to letting chaos reign versus trying to control things. But as entrepreneurs and as people in the city that are providing leadership, focus on making sure that your natural resources are available to any of the entrepreneurs who want to engage with them. Interestingly, if you look at a place like Boulder, one of Boulder's weaknesses is we have 5 separate startup communities. We have a tech community, which is software, internet type stuff, has a little consumer electronics in it, robots. We have a biotech, life sciences startup community, which is mostly linked to the university. We have a clean tech startup community, which is linked to a few of the national labs. NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, is here, along with a couple of other government labs. We have natural foods, which came out of all the pot-smoking hippies that settled here in the 1960s. And, you know, the beginning of the natural foods industry is Celestial Seasonings Tea, which is based in Boulder and was like the first company that anybody ever talked about as a natural foods company. But if you go into the Whole Foods and you start looking at labels on the back of things in Whole Foods, you're going to find a remarkable number of companies that come from Boulder. It'll freak you out. It'll make you run out of Whole Foods and go into Safeway. And then the last is something now called LOHAS, but it's essentially outdoors and healthy lifestyle. So we have these 5 separate startup communities, all that have natural resource links here to Boulder for some reason. The tech community exists because HP and IBM used to have very large facilities here, and so there was a very well-trained set of engineers in the 1960s that started a bunch of storage companies. And those storage companies begot a bunch of networking companies, and those networking companies begat a bunch of software companies, and those software companies begat a bunch of internet stuff, right, and on and on and on it goes. We don't have much connective tissue between those 5 startup communities. I know some of the people in them, and they know me, some of the other entrepreneurs, but we don't work together effectively. We don't leverage our co-natural resources. That's okay, right? That's a little bit of the let chaos reign. So I think it's both, but focus on natural resources versus trying to control things into a niche.
Hi, Brad. I'm Heather Kenyon. I'm the CEO of the Tampa Bay Technology Forum. Apparently, I'm a feeder, which is kind of disappointing to me, but anyway, I'll take it.
I'm a feeder too, so it's good to be.
I want to impact, not so much be a feeder, but
Well, but you can be a feeder and have huge impact. I think that's the key, right? So I'll let you ask your question, but I want to use this to make a point. I want people to be proud that they're feeders, right? I thought hard about the words, and I used the words so that they were a little uncomfortable, because your natural reaction is, I want to be a leader, not a feeder. But it's just as important to be a feeder. And it's really more important to understand the differences between those dynamics, and then as an individual play a leadership role rather than your organization being the leader. Ask your question.
Excellent. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind. Okay. So my question is, so we're actually holding this event at Valpak, which is a division of Cox Target Media, which is a huge company in our town. So how can large companies, you talked about large companies being a feeder, how can large companies be a huge impact in the entrepreneurial ecosystem? And I kind of talk about, I mean, we've had conversations with First Swanson, and ask the question in a minute. He talks about Atlanta, where large companies actually use smaller companies for their proof of concepts and that kind of thing as a feeder for the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And how can we do a better job of that in Tampa?
So a couple of very specific things. Number one, big companies, especially ones that are healthy and growing, tend to have a lot of resources that are beneficial to entrepreneurs, like, for example, this physical infrastructure. And so one of the things that big companies can do is help the startups and help the startup community by opening up its doors from an infrastructure perspective. Another is, the next step to that is to use startup companies, especially local ones, as vendors for different things. That's especially helpful for startups that are bootstrapping, startups that are trying to sort of find their way. That dynamic is very powerful. Another one is to be very inclusive. So one of the things big companies tend to struggle with is what happens when somebody from their company goes and leaves to start a company. There's a company in Kansas City, I'm going to forget the name of it, it's one of the large independent advertising agencies, and it's like 1,000 people, so it's a pretty large independent still. It's headquartered in Kansas City. And they've had a lot of people that were in Kansas City leave to start companies. A lot of people, 50. And every single person that leaves, it's with their blessing. And they say to every single one of them, if you want a job, you're welcome back anytime. And, oh, by the way, what are you doing? Oh, you're doing that? We might have some business for you. Because what they do is they view themselves as generative. Like, if the people want to start their own company, help them rather than try to hold on to them. what that does, it actually creates greater retention, because the people that are working for your company don't feel like, oh, I have to go work on my startup on its side and be quiet and secretive about it. Everybody's like, well, if I ever decide I want to start a company, that's cool, and I'll be supportive. The big company will be supportive versus it being something that's not good. So those are three. And then the fourth is a lot of big companies, again, this comes back to resources, is think about what you can do to help with the unique skills as a big company that you have in that startup community. So if you have a unique place in the, I don't know what Valpak does. Is Valpak advertising or coupons or consumer? What's
they do, marketing and coupons and that sort of stuff.
Valpak is coupons, yeah. So I know.
Direct email marketing.
Okay, so direct email marketing.
I'm not butchering this, Chris. You can.
No, that's good.
Yes,
I just need.
No. Yeah.
Let's use direct email marketing as an example, right?
Yeah, we had a great conversation with the CEO today, and he's very key. He comes from Austin. Is very key about innovation in marketing and sort of the marketing plan for the region and that kind of thing. But yeah, they do direct marketing campaigns. And the envelopes you get in the mail, the direct mail campaigns, and then emails as well.
So, one of the things to do is say to the startup community, look, we are experts at this. We have buying leverage here. If you want to leverage our resources for this kind of thing for your business, we will help you. And make it for your local startup community, not for everyone in the world, but for your local startup community, a zero profit proposition. Or if it's not something that you have to functionally do, but something you can teach people, you have classes internally about certain things around direct email marketing. You teach your team how to do it. Include the entrepreneurial community. Have public educational events around that too. Don't hold on to these things that can be spread and can help the startups leverage what the big company has already figured out. So there's a few suggestions. All right, 2 more questions. I'm just paying a little attention to time. We'll do 2 more.
Hey, Brad. It's Mark. How you doing?
Hey, Mark.
So one of the things in the other cities that I've done startups in, like Atlanta or up in New York or out in the Valley, you tend to have clusters of communities where they focus on certain areas, like Georgia Tech in Atlanta or Route 128, or in Silicon Valley, south of San Francisco there, or there's a few of them. But in Tampa, it's a little different because there's a variety of areas that people are trying to do build startups in. And so my question is, how important is it to have clusters within geographic areas to get some synergies going versus having everybody spread out?
Yeah, so entrepreneurial density is super important. And what I mean by that is that you want to actually have as much concentration as you can of entrepreneurs and of startups in a relatively tight geographic area. So in Boulder, for example, downtown is where, I don't know what the percentage is, but of companies under 50 people, it's probably 2/3 of the companies under 50 people are in 5 by 10 blocks. Now, that's not something that you coordinate. So it's not that you say, startups, go over there. That doesn't work. What you do is startups should want to have affinity and gravitate towards each other. And in a bigger city, Boulder's a relatively small place. In Denver, which is 2 million people, there's a couple of neighborhoods, and I call them neighborhoods instead of communities, that make up the Denver startup community. In Boston, which is actually 2 cities, Boston and Cambridge, there's actually 6 neighborhoods that comprise the Boston startup community, 3 in Cambridge and 3 in Boston. For those of you that know Boston, Central Square, Harvard Square, and Kendall Square are all 1 train stop away, Kendall, Central, Harvard. They're totally different startup neighborhoods. They have different feels, the restaurants are different, the styles are different, but they're all part of the same startup community, and people move between the neighborhoods quite freely. So in New York, it's not Manhattan, it's Union Square, and it's Flatbush in Brooklyn, and it's the Metro Tech Center in Brooklyn, and it's the area on the West Side Highway between 20th and 38th Street. These are the startup neighborhoods. And so if you have half a dozen of them in Tampa, that's fine. Encourage entrepreneurs to collect around those neighborhoods. As participants, whether you're on the leader side or the feeder side, move around and do things in the different neighborhoods. Look for ways to create this entrepreneurial density. It's very powerful.
This should be interesting.
How's it going, Brad? I've been working on a company for about a year here now, very passionate about building the ecosystem here and everything. We just picked up our first customers, our clients. We're about to get our first check, an enterprise level sale. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to get on the ground floor with one of those $50,000 checks to Tampa Bay.
That's not, I'm going to do it, but I'm happy to be on the ground floor.
Awesome. So I'll tell you a little bit about it, and then maybe I can follow up on a phone call later.
Yeah.
Cool. So we've built a club and event management system for universities. A big problem with college campuses is the other side of academics, which is student life. The actual engagement that students have with clubs and everything, which actually we have white papers on that show that as students get more engaged, they actually retain with campus colleges longer, they stay in their communities longer, and they actually learn more doing those things and other things. But up until now, there's no data around any events or anything going on with that. So we've built a way to swipe student ID cards via mobile phones with a dongle just like Square that captures that data live at the events, pings university data, and builds in-depth analytics for clubs and events to be able to build and allocate funding for student governments, which for a campus like USF Tampa is $15 million a year, and clubs to actually be able to increase in market to increase engagement on campus.
Cool.
So we've got, yeah.
Great idea. My email is brad@feld.com. Feel free to send me a note about it.
Sure.
I can tell you a priori that I'm not a good candidate for you because Foundry Group, my venture firm, it's not something we'd invest in. It's too vertically focused for us. And if you want to see what we like to invest in, go to foundrygroup.com/themes. And then personally, I no longer can make angel investments in tech-related companies. Everything I do that's tech-related goes through Foundry Group. I can make angel investments in non-tech related companies. So most of my angel investments for the last couple of years have been in food related stuff because I figure if the thing fails, at least I can eat the food. So, you know, I'm an investor in Justin's Nut Butter, and I'm an investor in a chocolate company which has basically failed, but it was good chocolate. And a company in New York called Rick's Picks. But I'm happy to give you some feedback. And, you know, one of the quick hit things that I would tell you, there's a lot of people that are doing things in and around what you're describing. You're the first person I've ever seen that had a Square-like attachment for swiping student ID cards, so I think that's particularly clever. And one thing I'd encourage you is your business definitely feels like a business that you can make a lot of progress with real customers without raising much money. And this comes back to the capital question earlier. Don't view raising money as the thing that's important. It's just one input into the system. My first company, we raised $10. We had 10 shares of stock, each $1 a share. That was the only money we ever raised. And I think we get lost in this a little bit with, you know, venture capital and reading TechCrunch and raising $10 million. Make as much progress as you can with the least amount of money. And if you don't need to raise any money, even better, you get to keep all your company. If you raise money, raise the smallest amount you need from people who can actually help. And just keep building. And the more you build, the easier it is to raise the next wave of money. It's just very powerful.
Cool. Thank you very much, Brad. We've got a lot of different verticals we can move into, so I'll follow up for sure.
Cool.
Thank you.
I don't know if we have time for a last question. Do you think?
If we have one more,
Yeah.
let's do. If there's one more, let's do it. He's already got out of his chair, so come ask it. Come.
Who? Oh, looking at you? Okay.
Oh.
Hey, Brad. Oh, I don't know if that was Brad. David Meadows here. How are you? Thank you very much for tonight. My question is, in our local community, we have a lot of, it's been very siloed organizations over the last 5-10 years. Fortunately, they're all starting to collaborate now. But there are separate communication channels. So if you're part of TBTF, you'll get the emails about that event. If you're part of TIE, you might get emails about that event. So there are lots of events going on, like you talked about, which is good. But have you seen in any other communities where they might have, say, some sort of pass that you can be part of all the organizations so that you might go, you know, easily to any one of them? Or that's kind of my question. How do you how do you get all of them communicating together so that maybe you can see all the different events on one page versus going to every 50 different organizations that are hosting the events, something like that.
So there's an organization that was created called Startup Digest. It got started in San Francisco. I think the second Startup Digest might have been in Boulder, actually. And now there's 100 of them. And Startup Week.
Sorry, that's right.
He said we have one.
We have one. So Startup Digest got taken over by Startup Weekend, or Startup Weekend now runs it. And somebody in your community should be doing Startup Digest. And what I encourage is the following things. Number one, find the person that does it, whoever it is that's doing it. And all of those organizations that you're getting stuff from that's not on Startup Digest, just start sending that person all that stuff. Because the whole idea of Startup Digest is you don't have to ask permission to those organizations to list it on the Startup Digest. And then if everybody's subscribing to Startup Digest and seeing what's going on, all of those organizations will want to be on Startup Digest so that people know what's actually going on. So this is the interesting phenomena of it being entrepreneur-led, totally organic, and just because it's painful, right? The reason Startup Digest exists is exactly the problem you described. But if you have to go to each of those organizations and say, hey, could you put your event calendar in this format and create this XML feed for me? Never going to happen. But to have somebody who, spends an hour a week cranking out, what then becomes an email that goes out to everybody once a week, that's not a big deal. So figure out simple ways to solve for those problems. But yes, great example of something that that should be able to be developed organically. So hopefully this is helpful. I know you guys are going to have a long session after this, or maybe not a long session, but a session after this, so hopefully I gave you some food for thought.
Brad, thank you so much. Thank you. Oh my gosh.
Right.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you give some great recommendations to Ruben. We're very proud of it. He was a little nervous about talking about that. So.
I know, he was great.
Give us some support. I'm going to call him Moxie from now on, so he's really brave to do that. So thank you so much for coming to Tampa virtually, at least your head. Anyway, it was nice to see you. Glad you're getting some work-life balance and be able to leverage technology. We like that. Yep. And we're going to do this amazing ideation session where we're going to try to figure out this whole ecosystem for the Tampa Bay region. So thank you again for being here. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. All right, good luck, everybody.
All right, take care.